On June 22, 1941, the German invasion began. By then, Moscow had already received many warnings. That is the contradiction at the center of this story. The Soviet leadership was not blind, yet it was not ready. The usual version reduces everything to one ignored message, one stubborn ruler, one fatal mistake. The documents support something harsher and more complicated. Reports arrived from intelligence channels, from diplomats, from foreign governments. Some were sharp, some were vague. Some pointed to war soon, others to pressure, bluff, or delay. At the same time, Germany concealed its preparations with unusual secrecy, and Stalin feared being pushed into a war before he believed it could no longer be avoided. So the gap was not between total ignorance and perfect knowledge. It was a gap between fragments and decision. In the spring of 1941, warnings reached Moscow through more than one pipeline. Intelligence organs reported German troop concentrations and preparations. Diplomatic channels added their own impressions. Foreign governments also passed on alarms. The broad fact is secure. The Soviet leadership was receiving repeated notice that something dangerous was building to the west. But quantity is not the same as judgment. The reports did not line up into one clean conclusion. They differed in timing, in precision, and in confidence. Some suggested an attack was imminent. Others implied pressure, coercive diplomacy, or preparation whose exact purpose remained unclear. Information arrived late, incomplete, and through institutions that did not always trust one another. That matters because hindsight flattens uncertainty. From the perspective of June 22nd, every fragment can look like part of an obvious pattern. In Moscow before the attack, the pattern was less stable. Intelligence officers and political leaders were not comparing a few perfect reports against reality already known. They were sorting a flood of claims, some credible, some doubtful, some impossible to verify in time. One document, often singled out in later retellings, came on the 17th of June, 1941. It is widely cited because Stalin reportedly reacted with a hostile marginal note, dismissing the source rather than treating the warning as decisive. That episode is real enough to be useful, but it can mislead if it is treated as the whole story. The significance of the note is not that one message would have saved the Soviet Union. Its significance is narrower and more revealing. Even very late, Stalin distrusted at least some of the reports placed before him. That distrust grew inside a system already clogged by uneven information. Historians who have studied the pre-war reporting generally do not describe a single missed signal. They describe accumulation without certainty. By June, many pieces pointed toward war. Yet the pieces came from different directions, carried different weight, and did not produce one uncontested verdict at the top. The political setting made the intelligence harder to trust. Soviet leaders had reasons to suspect that Britain wanted war between Germany and the Soviet Union, and wanted it sooner rather than later. Historians support this point, though carefully. Fear of British manipulation influenced Soviet interpretation of at least some warnings, but it does not explain everything by itself. From Stalin's position, a false alarm carried its own danger. If Moscow visibly mobilized too early or too openly, Berlin might present that step as a provocation. Even if Germany was already preparing to attack, Stalin still had to think in terms of timing. He had spent years trying to avoid entering a major European war before he considered the moment forced upon him. That fear shaped his reading of information. Reports from outside the Soviet system could be discounted as interested, exaggerated, or designed to produce a Soviet move. Warnings that pointed too neatly to an immediate German strike may have looked suspicious for exactly that reason. They were not necessarily false. But to a leader already inclined to suspect pressure from London, they could appear politically convenient for Britain. This helps explain the strange combination visible in the record. Moscow did not ignore all danger. Soviet leaders understood that German power was massing. They also understood that a careless response could have consequences. The problem was that caution, once built into the system, did not stay modest. It became a habit of delay. Stalin's error, if one wants to call it that, was therefore not simple passivity. It was a decision to hold back from steps that might signal full acceptance that war was at hand. Under uncertainty, that choice had a logic. Under the conditions of June 1941, it was a costly logic. The other side of the story lies in Germany's preparations. Operation Barbarossa did not emerge from rumor. It was a real, documented plan, prepared under strict secrecy and later preserved in captured wartime records. German command structures treated the invasion as a top-secret operation. That did not make it invisible. It made it harder to read correctly and in time. Large military movements could be observed. Concentrations near the frontier could be reported. Yet observation did not automatically yield certainty about date, scale, or final intention. A vast frontier produces noise as well as evidence. Troops move for many reasons. Plans can be revised. Signals can be planted or misread. Even when the strategic danger was obvious, the exact moment remained elusive. This is where later myths become too neat. If Soviet intelligence saw German preparations, why did it not simply name the day? Because intelligence rarely works that way, and because the Germans were imposing discipline on the process. Their secrecy did not erase the signs, it fractured their meaning. The Soviet side could detect danger without possessing a reliable clock. By June, however, the problem was no longer whether Germany was dangerous. It was whether the concentration of signs had crossed the threshold that should trigger unmistakable action. Historians generally answer that the failure before June 22nd came from several things acting together: uneven reporting, political caution, and effective German concealment. No single factor is enough. German secrecy matters because it narrowed the margin in which Soviet hesitation could still be corrected. So Barbarossa was not hidden by magic, it was hidden by method. Planning restricted to a small circle, movements managed under wartime discipline, and a diplomatic environment in which warning and deception could coexist. By the final days before June 22nd, the Soviet problem was no longer a lack of warnings. It was the absence of a reliable mechanism that could convert warning into unmistakable action over Stalin's reluctance to escalate. That is a colder explanation than the legend of one ignored report, but it fits the evidence better. The report of the 17th of June is useful again here. Stalin's reported dismissal of it shows a habit of mind. Late alarm was still not enough if he distrusted the source, the motive, or the timing. This did not mean he believed Germany harmless. It meant he remained unwilling to act as though war had definitely begun before the first blow fell. That distinction is fatal in military affairs. States can live for a time with ambiguous intelligence. Armies close to the frontier cannot live long with ambiguity in command. Once the invasion started on June 22, 1941, the distance between what had been reported and what had been ordered became brutally clear. Some interpretations go further and portray Stalin simply as a man who refused to believe any warning. The evidence supports a firmer but narrower conclusion. He distrusted parts of the warning stream, feared premature moves, and delayed full acceptance of what many signs were indicating. Historians differ in emphasis, but the broader picture is steady. Intelligence problems, political caution, and German secrecy reinforced one another until delay itself became a decision. That is why the story remains unsettling. There was no shortage of signals, there was no single missing clue. There was a leadership system in which fragmented intelligence met distrust at the top, while the opponent used speed and secrecy to compress time. When people ask why Stalin did not believe the warnings, the most accurate answer is that he believed too little of them, too late, and in the wrong way. Not because one report failed, but because a mass of imperfect information never became a command in time. The disaster of June 1941 cannot be explained by a single document, a single spy, or a single moment of blindness. The record points to something more difficult: warning without clarity, caution hardened into delay, and an enemy skilled at concealment. Stalin did receive signs. Some were strong enough that they should not be dismissed in retrospect as mere rumor. Yet he faced them through a filter built from suspicion, political calculation, and a system that did not turn uncertainty into timely readiness. Germany benefited from that filter. So the real lesson is not that information was absent, it is that information, even in abundance, can fail when leaders distrust its sources, fear the consequences of acting, and wait for certainty that war never grants.